Today we're talking about fuel systems, how to set them up, some mistakes to avoid, and how to get the most out of them. So let's get started. So it doesn't really matter what you're working on, whether it's a carburetor, a throttle body EFI, a direct port EFI. Really, getting the fuel system set correctly is where you're going to make all your biggest difference at. If you don't get that set correctly, if you fail to set it properly for what you're working on and get all the pieces and components right, that's where you're going to fail. And it doesn't matter how you adjust these. If you don't get that correct, you're going to struggle. You're going to stumble with it. You're not going to be able to get the most out of it. And most people will start with, trying to set the jetting and the power valve, or they'll get the rods and the jets and they'll get frustrated with it, and really it's not the carburetor or the throttle body's fault. Where the fault lies is with the fuel system. So let's take a look at the individual pieces of the system and how it goes together. Now, if you've watched any of my videos before on Edelbrock carburetors especially, you know what's coming up next, and that's talking about the fuel system. If you get the pieces and parts right together on this fuel system, you'll support whatever you're working on much, much better. Now, there's no junk carburetors on the market. Well, there's a couple, but they're the Chinese offshore knockoff type stuff. But the Holly is a really great carburetor for what it's designed to do. The Edelbrock is a really, really good carburetor for what it's designed to do. Throttle body fuel systems, there's some questionable ones out there on the market, but really even the good ones like the fast system that I tend to use a lot of, they're really, really good, but you have to get the fuel system right to support it. Same goes with the ignition system. If the ignition is wrong, if you don't have the timing set properly, if you don't have, the advance and the spark set correctly, the wires aren't good, you have the wrong, spark plugs in it, doesn't matter what it is, if you don't have the ignition side set right, same with the fuel system, you're going to run into problems. And this is where most of the problems come from when people bring me a carburetor and say, I've got this horrible stumble, or it stinks of fuel, it's flooding, I can't get it to set right, and all they're doing is monkeying with the fuel, the adjustment screws here for the idle, and the mixture screws don't really do much of anything past 1,000 RPM. Doesn't matter what carburetor you're working on here, or they've got a fuel system on a EFI where they've got a cold start issue. Doesn't matter. It's almost always goes back to the fuel system or the ignition system. It's a big number most of the time. Now, you get those components, set right, all of this kind of works out much better. But we're going to talk about each individual piece here next, and I'm going to talk to you or show you where the mistakes are made and how to set this up properly, so you can, when you get to adjusting these, it'll work out much better. Now let's talk about fuel pumps, because it seems to be where everybody starts. The thought being is, if you go to an auto parts store and buy a brand new fuel pump off the shelf, that it's good. You don't have to worry about it anymore. If you buy a good electronic, inline or in-tank type fuel pump, that once you buy it, then it's done. It's over with. You don't have to do anything else. And that's where the trouble starts. Not so much on the electric side, because most people know that if you buy an electric fuel pump, I would hope anyway, that you're going to need to run a pressure regulator with it. But again, it's more on the mechanical side that I'm going to talk about here. And this pump here specifically is a really, really good example. About 2 weeks ago, I worked on a car where the gentleman went to the auto parts store, bought this particular pump, and put it on the car. And okay, perfect. Doesn't need anything else. I've eliminated that as a problem. We're good to go. Well, this pump here, again, I'm not going to mention the brand name. It doesn't matter. It was a cheap, one at O'Reilly or AutoZone. Doesn't matter. But I kept it because when we put this pump on the car, it made 7.3 pounds of pressure. Now, the manufacturer of this pump stated that it made 5.25 pounds of pressure. That's what it was set at from the factory. Good to go. Customer said he didn't need a fuel, or the guy at the counter told him, no, you don't need anything else. Pump's good. Fine. Nothing else you need in the fuel system. Change the fuel filter. Good to go. Well, without a pressure regulator, you wouldn't know what this pump was putting out. And that's what his problem was. Carburetor was flooding. It happened to be a Holley carburetor. Guy couldn't figure out why he was having so much flooding problems. He adjusted the needle and seats in the carburetor, replaced them multiple times, set them low, thought the floats were bad, so he replaced the floats, bought new needle and seats, you name it. He's done everything. He was about ready to throw the carburetor into the trash. Holley's junk. Well, no, it's not. The carburetor wasn't at fault. The fuel pump was putting out too much pressure, and it was pushing it past the needle and seats. And that is a very, very, very common problem, that people assume that when you buy a pump off the shelf, that it says it's set at whatever pressure, that's the pressure it's at. Now, that's not uncommon, but on a new pump off the shelf, it's very common. Almost half of them are not at the pressure that the manufacturers say they're set at. They almost always come in a little higher, a little lower, but this one happens to be said at from the manufacturer that it was set at 5.25 psi, which honestly on a stock engine carburetor, that's probably perfect. You wouldn't need to monkey with anything else, and you wouldn't need another adjustment point in the fuel system. But in this case, definitely needed it. In the case of the electronic fuel pump or electric fuel pump, it doesn't matter what they're factory preset at. Same thing with the mechanical. Always run a fuel pressure regulator, because that's the only way you're going to know exactly what that pump is putting out. And we're going to talk about regulators right now. All right, so let's talk about fuel pressure regulators now, because again, that's a key component of the system. And when you're talking about a carbureted setup, which is the easiest one here, and you're running a mechanical fuel pump or an inline frame-mounted pump, then you'll run tank, your two fuel filters. Pressure regulator will go right before the carburetor. After the fuel filter, the last fuel filter, which this one's a 10 micron fuel filter, then you'll run the pressure regulator. That's where it goes within the system. Now, pressure regulators are two different types. They are a deadhead style, like this one is, and there is a bypass style or a return style. Non-return, return. And what that means is that there is a port on this regulator that allows the fuel to bypass the regulator when it is not feeding the carburetor and get plumbed back to the fuel tank. Now, that's important because typically, especially on EFI systems, you can run a deadhead style regulator on them, but typically I like to run a return type of regulator back to the tank. Now, that opens up a lot of other issues with that, because now you've got to run another fuel line back. Now you have to make sure that the tank is set correctly. And if you remember, we did the little video on the little fuel system bung, the riv nut style. I'll leave a link to that video so you can take a look at that. But that way you can convert your fuel tank into a return style fuel tank without having to, go do anything more complicated. Now, we've also done the video on the Aeromotive Phantom fuel system, which is really a nice setup because it drops the pump into the tank, which is the optimal place to be. In all of this, the pump in the tank is the best place to be. Not on the engine, not frame mounted, in the actual fuel tank itself. And you can see that video. I'll leave a link to that one down below. Anyway, the regulator is key in this component with the bypass, because it keeps the fuel moving through the system. Now, you can argue that the fuel stays cooler. There's no science behind that. I don't have any data to show that the fuel in the tank stays cooler by continuing to push it back to the tank. The exact opposite could probably be made, that you're pushing fuel into the or into the engine compartment where it's warmer, fuel's in there for not very long, but it's getting bypassed back to the tank. No worries. I don't, that's not concerning to me. You're not going to raise it so high that you're going to get into the situation with ethanol that it boils at 180 degrees. It's just, you're going to warm the fuel up for sure with either style. The deadhead style means the fuel comes to the regulator and it stays there. It doesn't go anywhere else until it goes out to the carburetor. As the regulator needs to push it towards the carburetor, it's released from the valve in the regulator to send the right amount of pressure and the right flow of fuel to the carburetor. That's the difference between a return style and a returnless deadhead bypass. So hopefully that makes a little bit more sense to you. I'm a big fan of the Edelbrock style, or excuse me, the Aeromotive style. This happens to be an Edelbrock, very inexpensive pressure regulator. I found that this one works really well compared to the really cheap pressure regulators that are out on the market. You can buy one for, I don't know, 30, 40 bucks, I think, online somewhere, but this one happens to work out really well. I've had really good luck with it. Aeromotive, that's the standard. That one just works in every instance. It is the best pressure regulator. That's why I use a lot of their fuel filters. I use their pumps, and I use everything in the fuel systems that I do for my stuff anyway. It is a little more expensive, but it's made in the U.S. It's quality. It's done right. I never question it when it goes in. So anyway, when we're going back to talking about the pumps, the pressure regulator is where you're going to figure out if you've got a problem with the pump. Now, there was no way we would have known that there was a problem with this mechanical pump until we put a pressure regulator on it and a gauge to measure it. Now, it was the only way to adjust it anyway. Putting a gauge on it will tell you if there's a problem, but if you're going to do it, you might as well put the regulator on as well. So in this case, with that pump that he had, he wanted a different pump. I don't blame him. No big deal. He went out and got a different pump. I don't remember where he got it from, but anyway, it was fine. But he did end up putting a regulator and a gauge on it so you could have another adjustment point. And that's the other side of it. There's not many adjustment points that you can make on a carburetor as it sits. If you can add another adjustment point in it with a pressure regulator, that is huge because it's an analog system. There's not a lot of places where you can make an adjustment on it. And a pressure regulator gives you one more place where you can make that adjustment. In this case, it just happens to be in pressure going to the carburetor or the throttle body EFI, whatever it is. Always run a pressure regulator when you're running a carburetor. I know people don't do it. Most of them get along just fine, but there's the occasional problem, and that's typically when you're frustrated with it because now you don't understand why the carburetor is flooding. You can't get it to adjust right. You've got a bog off idle. You're losing fuel at the top end. Whatever the case may be, almost always we can equate that back to the fuel system itself, and the regulator is a great place to start. So again, it just gives you one more spot to give you some adjustability in a fuel system. Always run a pressure regulator. Personally, on my stuff, I always run a bypass regulator. Always. I want that fuel pushing back to the tank. I'd rather have it sitting back there than a deadhead style. Now, the deadhead style regulator works just fine. There's nothing wrong with it. That just happens to be my personal preference to run the bypass regulator. So now let's talk about fuel filters next. Okay, filters. Now, this happens to be one of my favorite things to talk about in a fuel system because, again, like everything else, like the pump, the regulator, and even the carburetor itself, this one gets a little confusing sometimes because some folks just can't understand what the reasoning is behind how we do this. These happen to be both 10 micron filters. They're just a little different style of filter. However, they are both, that one came apart easy. They are both a replaceable element style filter. You can replace the element, and that way you can continue to service this. It has a nice long life, and these, the nice bodies and everything last you forever. You just keep replacing filters as you need. Just depends on how horrible your fuel system is and how much garbage is in the tank, whatever. But having a replaceable element style filter is very key. This one just happens to be very large because you can run a much larger line through it. This is a -8 end on it. Yeah, that's a -8. So it's they're fixed ends on here, but that one you can put a -10, -12, whatever through it and be good to go. But filters, if you remember back to the chart again, that when we talk about filters between the pump and the tank If you're running a mechanical pump or a frame-mounted pump like this electric one, you'll want to run a filter between the tank and the pump here, and then between the pump and the regulator here. 100 micron there, 10 micron after the pump. If you are running a fuel system where the pump is in the tank, then run a single 10 micron filter between the tank and the regulator. Keep all the crap out of the regulator. Go ahead and eliminate the 100 micron, 10 micron if you're going to run pump and tank. It's just because you just don't have another place where you can put a pump, or excuse me, put a filter in that type of system. So anyway, wanted to show you that again. But again, these are both 10 micron filters. And again, Aeromotive, absolutely my favorite. I'll leave links to everything down in the description below. But these are for sure confusing when it comes to what size to run. So if you keep that in mind, that if you're running that style with a mechanical pump on the engine or that frame mounted one, 100 micron before the pump, 10 micron after, you'll be fine. Now you've seen lots of pictures or video probably of, pumps where there's a pump and then they'll attach the filters right to the pump, especially on an Aeromotive A1000 or any of those types of pumps that have a good way to secure the filter right to it. No problem at all. There's nothing wrong with that. They don't have to be separated by fuel line or whatever. It's just whatever your system dictates and what your space dictates. Doesn't really matter where the filter goes physically. You can attach it right to the fuel pump. When you're diagnosing problems with a fuel system, you're going to change filters very, very frequently. Now, I know that sounds wasteful and expensive to continue to change the elements within the filter, but if you're trying to chase down problems, especially if you're monkeying with anything in the fuel tank at all, you could loosen up more garbage within the system, and you want to catch it before it gets to the carburetor. So, I mean, yeah, you can continue to open up the carburetor and flush it out or whatever, but keeping as much crap out of there is the best way to go. So don't hesitate to buy a good replaceable element style filter and buy a whole bunch of replaceable elements for it, because you'd rather have them than not. And having a plugged up fuel filter, a fuel filter that restricts the flow or drops the pressure, because there's a filter in there, is certainly something you want to be careful of. So anyway, make sure you have good fuel filters. Follow the guide that I use with where to put them in the system and what size to use. Now, the last piece to this puzzle is the gauge. Now, having an underhood gauge to figure out what the pressure is at the pump going to the carburetor or what your regulator is putting out so you can adjust it is critical. Again, every piece that I've shown you within the fuel system, the pump, the regulator, and the filter are all super, super critical important, and none of them is less important than the others. But if you can't measure it, then you can't fix it. And so always put the gauge on there so you can see what pressure you're set at. Now, this one happens to be a liquid-filled one for an EFI setup. It goes up to 100 PSI. It's an Aeromotive one. Again, I'm a big fan of the Aeromotive stuff. It's just high quality. But there's plenty of other gauges out there. As long as you're comfortable with it, buy whatever brand that you want. I'll leave a link to the Aeromotive one for a carburetor and EFI setup down below. But certainly having a good gauge is critical, because it allows you to measure it so you can start making adjustments. And it really pulls this whole fuel system together. Again, last thing is just whatever fuel line you run. I happen to run Frigola on pretty much everything these days. So you've seen the demonstration on how to put the ends on this push lock style. Again, my favorite style now, unless something else comes out these days. That's probably what I'm going to stick with, because it's easy to assemble and it's just done right. And Frigola also has a PTFE rated line, so if you're running high ethanol fuel, they've got line that's capable of handling it. But that's the whole setup right there, with everything together. But again, get a good gauge in there. That way you can start measuring what you're doing. That's it. That's the whole setup right there. If you can fix those and get those right, it will make adjusting, especially on a carburetor, again, where there's fewer adjustment points in it, so much simpler. You'll eliminate all the problems and you'll do it right. Now, there's plenty of ways to do fuel systems, and I'm not telling you this is the end all be all, but for what I do and for what most of you all are probably doing, getting these set right and adding a regulator and making sure you can measure it with a gauge, having good fuel filters on there, it will make all the difference in the world when you actually get to the tuning side of carburation. So get the fuel system set up right. Again, we'll talk ignition somewhere down the road, but get the fuel system set up right, and everything else after that becomes very, very simple, because then these are tools to help you, not things that you'll fight trying to get it done. So again, if you've got any questions, don't hesitate, leave them down below. For sure, if you thought the video was good, you got something out of it, give me a thumbs up. Certainly, I always appreciate that. And again, this is probably one of the most important videos I've done, because again, the fuel system side of things is really where most of the problems that I get, people that trying to figure out what's going on with a carburetor stem from. And if you can correct it here and keep it maintained with the good fuel filters, you're going to be in really, really good shape. So anyway, I hope you got something out of it, and we will catch you guys on the next one.